Liz Rosenbaum, and I'm the founder of the Fountain Valley Clean Water Coalition that started in 2016 because our voices are not being heard. Okay, so we have a lot of community members here from our coalition. According to our rosters, we've had over 300 people sign in on our meetings that we've been holding every single month since 2016. I'm very honored to represent my community and hardworking and dedicated members of this water coalition. This presentation is a result of over 2 years of working together, doing research, meetings, and developing an action plan for a solution. You can join our coalition, see me afterwards. Next slide. Our Fountain Valley home is currently with over 70,000 residents, military, civilians, 4 water districts, and private wells. We also have multiple types of governmental jurisdictions overlapping the Widefield Aquifer. And the thing that we have in common is that we all want a safe place to live. And to us, it's not okay. We are still in danger. During this presentation, we will be identifying all the discrepancies and citizen concerns about the PFAS water contamination. What we've been focusing on over 2.5 years is the word safe. We want it defined specifically. We were told by our water districts our water is safe. We've been drinking PFAS contaminated water since the 1970s. It remains in our bodies for approximately 5 to 8 years, maybe longer. DOD has acknowledged these health effects, and we have a significant increase of cancers in our community. From March 2018, the Defense Department Congressional Report, PFOS and PFAS, is associated with developmental delays in children, in fetuses, and miscarriages, increased cholesterol, changes in the immune system, increased uric acid levels, changes in liver enzymes, prostate cancer, kidney cancer, and testicular cancer. And that picture that was shown from the summer of 2016, that's not how we remember that picture. We remember what we were told at the community meeting in the summer of 2016. And I quote, "It is hard to tell if these illnesses are a result from PFAS contamination or because of the higher rate of obesity and smoking in your community." What we heard: you don't matter because you smoke and you're fat. What right do you have to disrespect our community? We are responding with science-based evidence, and we're demanding changes. Next slide. We have been denied stakeholder status, and we are your largest stakeholder of 70,000 people. You had that one giant meeting in the summer of 2016, and you have not had one since. We have been denied stakeholder status, and again today in the lineup, we were not granted our request to go last in the lineup. Do not minimize what is happening here in our community. The EPA actually declared PFAS likely carcinogenic in 2005. And we keep saying contamination without representation is not going to stand in our community any longer. Next slide. Some PFAS chemicals have been testing at 68 parts per trillion. We have an EPA advisory of 70 parts per trillion. Are you okay with 68 parts per trillion in your drinking water? Widefield, Security, Fountain, and Strathmore Hills have all had drinking water wells testing above the EPA's limit of 70 parts per trillion since the 1970s up until about 2016, when alternate water sources and filtration systems were put in place. Identifying the contamination levels, locations, and actual facts about the process, such as The DOD says that 44 of the 88 off-base drinking water sources tested here in El Paso County are exceeding the EPA's limit. And there's even one place on Peterson Air Force Base that is 88,000 parts per trillion. It has not been safe to drink since the 1970s, and PFAS chemicals accumulate in our bodies, and we'd like to know for sure how long it will take to completely get out of our systems. The EPA advisory does not force our water districts to filter our water. It's just an advisory. We're really fortunate that our water districts have done as much as they have done to ensure the safety of our community. We're very grateful for that because they did not have to do it, but they did. And these are the levels that our drinking water would be at, as a reminder, if we were not getting things filtered or from alternate water sources. But that doesn't solve the fact that our entire aquifer is contaminated. If another contamination happens, what will we do? We're borrowing water from other sources. What is going to happen to Colorado Springs, Fountain, Widefield, Security, Stratmore Hills, if we have another big water contamination and nowhere else to go? How long is this contamination going to last in our aquifer? How large will the plume be? In Minnesota, they stopped dumping PFAS in the 1970s, and the plume has grown over 125 miles. I want you all to hear that. The plume has grown over 125 miles. Will communities under 10,000 people be tested? How will the people around us be affected? What about our family pets, urban farms, urban gardens? The list of questions continues. What makes our community different from other communities in the United States, and why the EPA is actually here to listen to us as one of their 5 summit locations? We are the longest polluted community. We still have an active base next to us, and we are concerned about not only ourselves, but our community members who used to live here as well. You can go a couple of slides. Okay. To the community members here, we feel that we have an inconsistent state and federal response, probably because we have not been invited to any of the stakeholder meetings. CDPHE is not testing us for PFAS blood level. These are the states who are offering free blood testing levels for their members affected by the same contaminant as we are. New York, New Hampshire, Vermont, and Pennsylvania. It can be done for us, but it has not yet. We don't have an enforceable statewide or federal PFAS drinking water limit. In New Jersey, they went ahead and set it at 14 parts per trillion, and in Vermont, 20 parts per trillion. Next slide. No statewide or federal responses for public-private wells less than 70 parts per trillion. In 1991, the Army Corps of Engineers told Fort Carson to stop using AFFF, and it must be replaced with non-hazardous substitute. In 1997, Fort Carson declared PFAS hazardous and dangerous to the environment and shouldn't flow untreated into our ecosystems, nor the sewage. But Peterson Air Force Base continued doing that, and that's all part of the DOD. And this is another example of contamination without representation in our community. And this slide demonstrates we need to find a unified agreement for a realistic, acceptable MCL of a maximum contaminant level for the entire country. The dark blue on the left is the EPA level, in the middle is the ATSDR recommendation, And last is what the state of New Jersey has decided on as a state mandate. For those of us in this community, a lack of transparency is a lack of trust. And which level of safe do you want us to believe? Before we had the advisory, these were some of the levels that our drinking water was at. From the absolute highest, which was obviously not one of our drinking wells, but it was a location in which the PFAS was just leaching into our ground. The EPA advisory said the 70 parts per trillion in 2016, ATSDR toxicology at 10, and then we're looking at other science-based research, which includes research done by the manufacturers. And even the manufacturers of the chemical knew that it was cancer-causing because their employees were dying from it. But yet they didn't have to tell anybody or release it to the public. So the manufacturer is at fault just as much as the user. When will our rights to safe drinking water outweigh the profits of these corporations? This is a crime against us. Financial challenges from our PFAS exposure. Our community members should not be responsible for the cost of fixing this contamination. Additional costs to ensure clean drinking water, expensive blood level testing, or medical monitoring. We still have community members with private wells in the affected areas that have not gotten their well tested yet. Raise your hand if the county or the state has not tested your well. And she's asked. And she lives in the area. And we have one more. Our community members do not trust what we are reading or hearing that our water is safe to drink, and the majority of us are still purchasing bottled water. As you will hear during the listening portion of tonight's summit, we have families struggling with devastating illnesses and deaths in their families. They want to know, is it environmental contamination, instead of being told it might be hereditary. Next slide. Our community wants PFAS recognized as an entire class and not individually, since there are over 3,000 chemical chains of PFAS. Some pieces of the chain can get through filters, then reconnect later on down the line to become a whole chain again. We want a national and enforceable MCL of 1 part per trillion. We want wastewater included in the data analysis because we are all downstream from someone else, and we don't want the people downstream contaminated as well. Next slide. These are the 4 specific demands in our community. We want the EPA to mandate a seat at the stakeholder table for the citizens who have been contaminated. No more behind closed doors meetings. We are the largest stakeholder and we are not being addressed. We are not having our concerns answered. And we've been told, why does it matter to you what the other water district does? Make a national enforceable MCL of 1 part per trillion and include all PFAS as a class and not individually. We want biomedical monitoring for all people, those who live here now and those who no longer live here because they moved to another part of the city or another country or another state because they're military. We're a community of incorporated and unincorporated status, county versus city, etc. And earlier I said, we were asked, what do you care if you live in security as to what Widefield does? Here's an example of a typical family stay. A family lives in the Widefield Water District. The children go to school in the Security Water District. And after school, friends and other relatives have homes in Fountain Water District or private wells. How many of you want to go to her house and drink the water that hasn't been tested yet and she lives in the area? We all, here's the kicker, why should Colorado Springs care? We all go into Colorado Springs and use the bathrooms. So Colorado Springs wastewater is affected. PFAS blood level testing is a human rights issue. We did not consent, nor were we aware of the PFAS contamination, and 70,000 of us are not official stakeholders in decision-making meetings, and we are tired of contamination without representation. We believe that when we know better, we do better. So we better do it now rather than later. Literally, our lives are depending on making better decisions. Thank you to Colorado College for providing students to assist Fountain Valley Clean Water Coalition with research, a website, and support. And now their chemistry department is offering well testing because there's a few people who have not gotten their well tested by the county or the state. Thank you to Colorado School of Mines for additional research. Thank you to Dr. John Adgate for searching out a grant that we wrote a letter to get 200 of us tested with our blood. We're still waiting on results, but that's not even 1/10 of our, it's not even 1% of our population. Thank you to the EPA for hosting this event. Now is the time to support the citizens, the main stakeholders who have been ignored. And finally, thank you to our amazing and connected community. We are in this for the long haul, and we are demanding a solution. Thank you.
I'm Silva-Blayney. I'm the chair of the Sierra Club Fountain Creek Water Sentinels. Our mission is to protect, restore, and improve the Fountain Creek watershed. Fountain Creek flows for about 75 miles, passing through Manitou Springs, Colorado Springs, Fountain, and Pueblo. I wanted to show this slide because 2 years after the discovery of the PFAS contamination, we still don't know how far the plume has spread. Next slide. Our members and volunteers live and work in the affected communities. We work hard. We put in many volunteer hours to protect our watershed. We conduct monthly water quality monitoring at Fountain Creek Regional Park. We hold monthly cleanups along Fountain Creek in Pueblo. We have a cleanup site behind the El Pomar Sports Complex in Fountain. The Sierra Club understands the connection between protecting our environment and human health. A healthy natural environment equals healthy humans. Next slide. I'm going to talk about some of the community challenges. Liz has already touched on some of them, and I'll try not to be redundant. We do have a unique circumstance in the Fountain, Security, Whitefield, and Strathmore communities. 3 of the 4 contaminated areas are unincorporated communities. There's been limited political representation. The community has not been treated as critical stakeholders. We see in contaminated communities in Michigan, Massachusetts, and New Hampshire, they were able to work with the Department of Defense and establish RABs. RABs are Restoration Advisory Boards. RABs enable the community to have a voice and to be part of cleanup efforts. This community asked for and was denied a RAB. Contaminated communities should not have to fight to have a voice in the remediation process. There has also been limited state support for medical monitoring. Other states that Liz mentioned offer free blood testing for people in PFAS contaminated areas. Some states also offer free biomedical monitoring. Colorado does not. Today, you're going to hear from community members who have lost loved ones. You'll hear from people who are sick. You'll hear from people who drank contaminated water for decades and now have diseases that are linked to PFAS contamination. Another challenge for the community, as you'll hear today from the panel, there are 4 different water districts. They've made heroic efforts, but there are different water treatments: granular activated carbon, reverse osmosis, anion exchange. All these remove PFAS and PFOA, but the community is confused about which water district is using the safest treatment. Many residents are still buying bottled water because they think it's safer than what comes out of their water taps. Next slide. So what is safe water? Currently, the messaging around PFAS chemicals is confusing, contradictory, and inconsistent. States have different responses to EPA PFAS health advisories. Health advisories are not enforceable. For example, you can see that Vermont has set the sum total for 5 PFAS chemicals at 20 parts per trillion, whereas Minnesota has a sum total for 2 PFAS chemicals at 62 parts per trillion. We need the EPA to set maximum contaminant levels for all PFAS so that water districts have to comply. It's impossible for everyday citizens to navigate the chemistry and the conflicting guidelines around what are safe PFAS levels. Next slide. I want to talk about trust. Specifically, I want to talk about the granular activated carbon, the GAC systems being installed to remove PFAS and PFOA. For decades, we've been turning on our water taps believing that the water is safe. To learn that we've been ingesting toxic chemicals and putting our health and our children's health at risk feels like a betrayal. Water districts here and around the country are installing granular activated systems to remove PFAS and PFOA. But the research suggests that GAC does not filter out shorter chain, unregulated PFAS chemicals. We need our water districts to utilize the current best technologies to clean all the PFAS chemicals from our drinking water. We're also concerned about the disposal process for the GAC spent media. The spent media is a byproduct of the GAC, and as PFAS and PFOA have not been designated as hazardous materials, the spent media can legally end up in industrial landfills, which means it ends up back in the soil or in the air when it's incinerated. We are then potentially recontaminating ourselves with the same chemicals. We need the EPA to list PFAS as a hazardous substance. Next slide. We have a unique urban wildlife interface in our community. Fountain Creek and other contaminated ponds are water sources for wildlife. The research shows that there is a significant impact to wildlife populations from exposure to PFAS chemicals. Let me be clear. The Sierra Club does not put wildlife health above human health, but there is a connection between a healthy ecosystem and a healthy community. When creating the National PFAS Management Plan, we want the EPA to consider impacts to the entire ecosystem. In our communities, backyard gardens and urban farming is a supplemental income or a supplemental food source. Community members have been using contaminated water to grow their vegetables and water their fruit-bearing trees. Our animals have been drinking contaminated water. There is distrust and fear about the soil that our food is grown in. We know that PFAS chemicals bioaccumulate and are persistent. Why isn't backyard soil being tested? When developing National PFAS Management Plan, we ask that the EPA consider impacts to backyard gardens and urban farming. Next slide. This is what the community is saying. We want transparency about the toxicity of PFAS chemicals. We want to know what those chemicals are doing to our bodies. When preparing the PFAS management plan, we want our lifestyles, for example, urban farming, to be considered. We want to know what those chemicals have done to the soil in our gardens, our children's playgrounds, and wildlife. We want military families informed and included in health monitoring. A large percentage of our community is comprised of military families who move away and have no idea they were drinking contaminated water. For consistent treatment and remediation of PFAS, we need a national maximum contaminant level for PFAS for drinking water and groundwater. We don't have time to regulate these chemicals one by one. Because the PFAS chemicals are toxic, persistent, and bioaccumulative, our children's, our grandchildren, and our great-grandchildren's health and lives are at risk. We want PFAS chemicals regulated as a family to protect our families. Regardless of filtration method, the Whitefield aquifer is still contaminated. 50 years from now, 100 years from now, the Whitefield aquifer will still be contaminated if we don't figure out a way to clean it. Is remediation even possible? More research is necessary. The problem isn't going away. Who's going to pay? Remediation's expensive. Treating contaminated water is expensive. The burden for compliance will fall to the water districts and public utilities. This is a burden that will ultimately be passed to ratepayers. The chemical industry, and it is an industry, DuPont and Dow and 3M created these chemicals. They knew what the associated health risks were. They put profits over human health. They should be held accountable. We need to make polluters pay. The burden should not be put on the taxpayers. We need action now. We appreciate that the EPA has stated that it has plans to take steps to evaluate the need for maximum contaminant levels for PFAS and PFOA, and that the EPA says it will propose designating PFAS and PFOA as hazardous substances. The EPA also says it will develop groundwater cleanup recommendations for PFOA and PFAS. We are past the point of evaluating, proposing, and recommending. People's lives have been compromised. It's time to regulate, enforce, and remediate. Currently, the EPA has several regulatory mechanisms to address the PFAS issue. One of these is the Safe Drinking Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act, which authorizes the EPA to set national health-based standards for drinking water for man-made contaminants. All of the 30-plus PFAS chemicals are man-made. We want the EPA to use their regulatory power and set national standards for PFAS. Under provisions in the Clean Water Act, classifying PFAS as a hazardous substance would trigger required reporting and testing for PFAS. We want PFAS listed as a hazardous substance and put on the toxic pollutant list. This is our community. This is our watershed. This is not a Fountain, Security, Whitefield, or Strathmore Hills problem. This is a Colorado problem. This is a nationwide problem. People are sick. People have died from PFAS contamination-related illnesses. Many of the people in this room are here today because they are worried about their health and the health of their loved ones. We need the EPA to fulfill its mission, which is to protect human health and the environment. We want answers. We want action. We welcome the opportunity to provide community input. And we hope that the EPA will continue to engage our community as stakeholders. Thank you.
This is, after all, a community listening session. Hi, my name is Susan Gordon, and for 11 years my family lived and worked on the Benatucci Farm, which is a 200-acre organic community farm just 10 miles to the southwest of and down gradient of Peterson Air Force Base, which is the primary source of the PFAS contamination in our community. This iconic community farm, which for decades distributed free pumpkins to thousands of various school children, was just one of the many casualties of the PFAS crisis in this community. The farm sat atop and was wholly dependent upon water from the contaminated Whitefield aquifer for both our domestic and agricultural water needs. Not only were my husband, 2 daughters, and I unknowingly drinking the PFAS contaminated water for over a decade, we are also irrigating commercial vegetable crops, forage, and livestock with water polluted from wells testing at almost 4 times the EPA health advisory of 70 parts per trillion. Sadly, in 2017, the farm was closed due to contamination of its only water source. When the farm shut down, we lost our jobs, our home, and our community. But most importantly, we left there with a great sense of uncertainty about the future impact of this PFAS exposure on our health after our blood tests, paid for by our employer, revealed levels of combined PFAS over 100 times of that found in the general population. And I want to note that it was the PFHXS, the 6 chain, that was the highest in our blood. And I would suspect that might be the case for others in the community. And I wanted to say, as a private well user, that my experience working with the Air Force was a bit different than the water districts. They did ultimately put a GAC at the farm, but only after I would sign an agreement saying that we would accept full responsibility for the ongoing cost and maintenance associated with that GAC filter. And they had no idea what that was going to amount to. They really had no idea of whether or not it was going to be effective, but I still had to sign that agreement before they would even come on and do any kind of treatment. And then it was good for about 4 months, and then they started seeing breakthrough and wanted to take it offline. So the Environmental Working Group, as you know, estimates that over 110 million Americans have been drinking PFAS-contaminated water. It is unacceptable that so many people are exposed to these very persistent and bioaccumulative PFAS chemicals, including my unborn grandchildren, who will receive it while in the womb, as well as through my daughter's breast milk. It is time to take precautionary measures to protect the most vulnerable. The science showing dangerous health effects from PFAS exposure does exist. The recently released ATSDR PFAS toxicology profile listed hepatic effects, cardiovascular effects, endocrine effects, immune effects, reproductive effects, and developmental effects linked to PFAS exposure. This same ATSDR study advocates for a standard 7 to 10 times lower than the current EPA health advisory of 70 parts per trillion. Scientific investigation has shown that a plausible risk exists, and the EPA has a social responsibility to act in order to protect the public from exposure to all PFAS chemicals. And you can do this by adopting an enforceable and protective maximum contaminant level of 1 part per trillion for all PFAS chemicals. We know now that the scientific evidence has existed for decades. It existed in internal 3M, DuPont, and Air Force documents hidden from the EPA and the public. Some of these documents only recently made available to the public as a result of court cases. But in spite of the data, the conscious decision was made to protect corporate profit over public health. The danger of these PFAS chemicals is also highlighted by the fact that in 2009, the Stockholm Convention, which is a legally binding UN-negotiated convention signed by 182 countries, added PFAS to the list of restricted, persistent organic pollutants. This was after rigorous scientific screening process. PFOA was nominated for review by the European Union in 2015, and a decision is expected next year. Unfortunately, like most global treaties to protect human health and the environment, the U.S. has not signed on to this convention. As the danger to human health is revealed, response across the country to PFAS contamination of drinking water sources has varied widely, with some states like Vermont, New Jersey, Minnesota, and Pennsylvania taking more aggressive action, adopting more protective drinking water standards, and holding polluters accountable. And as you know, some even making voluntary blood testing available to expose community members.
Thank you so much.
But I'm not done.
Next speaker may begin.
Let her speak. Let her speak.
Finally, those impacted by the contamination deserve a seat at the table. Here in Colorado, stakeholder meetings were held immediately after discovery of the high PFAS levels. But the largest stakeholder, as Liz pointed out, with the most to lose, the community, was not invited to the table. We requested and were denied both the Restoration Advisory Board from the Air Force as well as a citizen advisory panel by ATSDR. The EPA is taking a good first step by holding these community engagement meetings, but the voice of the community members needs to be included in future meetings as local and federal officials respond to the PFAS crisis. We need a voice and we need full transparency. No decision should be made about us without us. And I just want to close by saying that, in our community and many communities across the country and the world, the polluter happens to be the Air Force, which presents a particular regulatory challenge. Nonetheless, as one of the biggest polluters and greatest contributors to climate change, our military needs to be held accountable and held to the same protective regulatory standards as any other industry. Ironically, their mission is to protect the American public, yet time and time again, military practices have been responsible for the poisoning of our water, air, and soil. Our national security cannot be achieved at the cost of the destruction of the very things we as humans depend upon for existence. Thank you.
Toxics advisor for the Sierra Club. I work nationally, but for the last 10 years I've lived in Colorado. I want to thank all the people who testified, especially the community members who are at the forefront for sharing their stories and experiences. We've seen testimony about quick and effective and coordinated responses from EPA and the local water utilities and state government. But there are huge gaps that remain in preventing new contamination from the ongoing use of PFAS chemicals. There's an inability to remedy those exposures that have taken place in the past, and there's thousands of people who've had PFAS exposures who haven't been informed of that. And of course, it's still completely legal to make, use, sell, and dispose of products like PFAS that permanently contaminate the groundwater and contaminate people. We are hearing that people are scared for their families, they're suffering, and those who are healthy are haunted by the idea that PFAS damages that they've had in the past could lead to future illness. We know the crisis is growing, and every week new sites are discovered around Colorado and around the country. As a scientist and as a parent, I know that when it comes to our children's health, we only have one chance to get this right. Every year we wait for action. A new generation of children are being born. During pregnancy and infancy, their brains, their internal organs, their immune systems are affected by PFAS exposures. In many cases, these effects are permanent, and they shape their long-term health and development. During early childhood, kids eat more food and they drink more water proportionate to their body size than they will at any other point in their lives. We know that PFAS concentrations in people's bodies are 100 times or more higher than the water that they're drinking, and we know that when kids are breastfed or fed formula, those exposures are really astronomical and linger in their bodies for years. I see that EPA's action plan is limited, it's incomplete. The MCL process can take a decade. EPA pledged immediate action on perchlorate, another military drinking water contaminant, in 2011, and it's given it spaced effort, and there's not even a draft standard that's available to guide cleanup and to protect community levels. We see that EPA is only proposing to address 4 of dozens of classes of PFAS chemicals. The new generation of chemicals that are still widely used in military bases and airports, they'll persist in the environment, they're even more mobile in the groundwater, and they should be presumed to be harmful to health. We have abundant evidence that the health advisory level of 70 parts per trillion for PFAS and PFOA will not fully protect people from immune system damage, breast and prostate damage, and other harms. Scientists suggest that a truly safe level of exposure may not be possible, but a guideline of 1 part per trillion is advisable. Across the country, states are setting more protective drinking water standards, suing polluters, ending ongoing use of AFFF foam, and cleaning up water supplies. The state of Colorado can and should be doing more to protect our communities. Colorado's groundwater standard at 70 parts per trillion is too high. It should match those most protective standards in place in New Jersey and Vermont and suggested in the ATSCR draft report. Colorado's water law, groundwater law, should be extended to cover the entire state. I live near Boulder, where local use of AFFF foam by a rural volunteer fire district has contaminated the water supply. This hints to me at much greater contamination of exposures in rural fire districts, in urban firefighting. And Colorado should set a limit for all PFAS chemicals, particularly with these ongoing uses and contaminated sites, which also include landfills, land application of biosolids, metal plating, and the Rocky Mountain Arsenal. Thank you so much.
I've been a long-time activist in the area the military and the environment. I went to Restoration Advisory Board meetings at Fort Carson for a number of years. And I encountered a problem I think that we're seeing a lot of here in this issue. And that is playing national security as a trump card to protect everything in the military training area. And I don't know how the EPA, from its vantage point, can really do anything about it. When we tried to get into issues that related to military training at Fort Carson, including explosives on the impact ranges or fuel consumption of military training vehicles, that card was played. I do not know if the Air Force played that card in this dispute. One would assume maybe they did, because even the Army, as early as '91, knew this was bad stuff. Quit using it for that reason. But the Air Force, for some reason, held on against that consensus and continued to use it until the bodies started showing up in the morgue, until this thing really blew up and could not be avoided. And it especially concerns me to see how closed this loop is, where you have these city water departments coming up here and heaping profuse praise on the Air Force, which caused the problem in the first place, running through all kinds of red stop signs, and yet at the end, they come out looking like the good guys. So you have this closed loop, almost surely leading to more problems in that pipeline, because that card will be played over and over again to avoid environmental responsibility for the military.
I'm here to tell you how PFAS compounds have affected my life. My family, with my husband, who had just returned from Vietnam after being shot down 3 times, moved to security in 1972. I had a 20-month-old daughter and a 6-month-old son. We thought, security is a community that was built originally and housed many Korean veterans. My husband was an Army veteran. We thought this is going to be a wonderful place to raise our children. We were anxious to build our family home with all the health issues that the only health issues we were concerned with was his use of Agent Orange in Vietnam and his being around that. We continued our life in security, trying to lead a healthy life, not knowing what was leaking, what was just beneath us in our drinking water. The healthy life we chose to lead was we raised our own food. I canned the food, we raised chickens, rabbits, ducks, geese, you name it. And we seemed to have a really happy life, not knowing that chemicals were in our water all the time that we were drinking. Time passed, and our children grew up. As my children grew up, those of us in security received cautious information over the years regarding chemical spills into the Whitefield aquifer, cadmium from Eagle Pitcher, and other chemicals from Swag Walk. When my son was in his early 20s, he began having health issues with rashes and skin problems, which were eventually diagnosed as being an autoimmune disease. Well, throughout the years, he grew, he still continued to have some issues, but he did get married and he had 2 children. Well, he began having other health problems with his eyes. He was losing peripheral vision, all the while he was being diagnosed with various diseases, including MS and other things. Eventually, he was diagnosed with an autoimmune disease about 15 years ago. He lived with that, continually losing peripheral vision, but about 6 years ago he was declared legally blind. He could no longer work for his family with his 2 children or drive. In 2009, my husband, who by then time was my ex-husband, died of cancer. In March, I was diagnosed with an autoimmune disease, causing permanent hair loss. I came to tell my story. I am a 69-year-old woman living on Social Security and working part-time to supplement my income. I did not elect to go with the group that chose to sue because I feel the most important thing is to have our aquifer cleaned up. I'm not interested in money. I want money to clean up our aquifer. I thought I'd leave my children, my grandchildren, a small legacy, but what kind of legacy will I be leaving them? Constant health issues, declining home values, increased water and utility bills, questions about safe drinking water. When will we start taking human health above corporate profits? Please help me and us leave a legacy to everyone in the Fountain Valley area, to their children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and all generations to come by cleaning up our rich aquifer for drinking water. Again, my name is Carla Lucas, and I've lived in security for 46 years. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Family, and they've been hurt very bad, by this. My cousin Steve Patterson's here. His 13-year-old grandson had to receive a kidney transplant last year. My father died of kidney cancer last year. And my cousin Steve had to give his sister a kidney growing up. So not genetic, because my father, married into the family. Yet what they have in common is they drank water from the Whitefield aquifer. In 2005, the EPA said it was likely to cause cancer to humans. Yet, they didn't do anything. In Fort Carson in 1991, they felt the need to say that this was hazardous and have it removed. Yet we still don't have a regulation. And the director of the EPA could do a temporary to meet the CDC, who says the safe level should be 10, not what the EPA says at 70. And then, they say, oh, we need more studies. 64,000 people in West Virginia, they had their blood drawn, and it was shown, and they showed that kidney cancer was tied to this PFAS contamination. And then we say, oh, you need, it's not conclusive. But the Department of Defense decided to stop using sonar because against beached whales, when even the marine biologists said they couldn't say for sure that sonar affected the whales that way, but humans and our service members and our veterans don't get that same overprotection or overcaution that, that marine life seems to get. So as I end, I'll just read the obituary of one of my cousins who was in Whitefield. He married into the family, so it can't be a genetic context. And then just think about the service members and what the sacrifices they made for this country, and yet and still, we still don't want to regulate. Master Sergeant retired Sheldon Lee King was born in Shaw, Mississippi on March 16, 1935. In 1957, Sheldon embarked on a long and challenging career in the United States Army. After basic training, Sheldon was stationed in Germany and then at Fort Carson, Colorado. It was in Carl Springs that he met and married his wife, Elizabeth Ann Walker, my cousin, his wife. They were married for 50 years and began their family. His travels with the military took him to places such as a combat tour in Vietnam, Maryland, and Germany. In 1978, after 21 years of service, he retired from the U.S. Army. His awards included the Meritorious Service Medal, the Army Commendation Medal, the Vietnam Service Medal, the Bronze Star, the Vietnam Campaign Medal, the 60 device, the Vietnam Cross of Gallantry with Palm, and yet and still you have us begging you for people that sacrifice for this country, and you can't even be overcautious for their lives, and to me, that's not acceptable.